Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Ladani. I have known Bob Leto for 57 years, and I still remember the very first time I met him. We had just moved to Lindenhurst. I was placed in a ninth grade homeroom, and since it was alphabetically seated, I sat next to Bob. He had a pair of drumsticks in his back pocket, no lie, and that's how it all started. Bob was many things to me, but most of all, he was a true friend and brother. We laughed and cried and watched each other grow over the years. And like brothers, we argued and fought. But through everything, we never let it extinguish our friendship. Bob was a music mentor, a creative force that pushed my creativity, a partner in adventures and misadventures alike. Most of all, Bob accepted me for who I was and who I am. As a new kid to the neighborhood, he was the one that pulled me into the crew of himself and Joe Giacalone, Bob Gross, and along with my brother Phil, that was my core of closest friends in Lindenhurst. When we were teenagers, Bob would practice drums in his basement for 7, 8 hours a day. We would have to bang on the basement window to get him to come out to do whatever the guys had planned. I never forgot that because he was a great model for what dedication could accomplish. Of course, that's not how it seemed at 17. We just wanted to go have fun. And speaking of fun, Bob's bedroom in the finished side of his parents' Cape Cod attic was Party Central, the place where we hung out most of the time for many years, complete with the required black lights, posters, sound system, and so on. Oh my God, when we would leave his room at night, the cloud of herbal smoke would billow out through the door. Our illicit experimentation up there would be better characterized as heavy research. Looking back, Mr. and Mrs. Leto must have been saints to put up with our laughing, debating, some would say arguing, the music, and us carrying on at all hours. I think they were enlightened enough to know that better that we carried on up there than who knows where. Bob's parents were pretty hip and always supported his early love of jazz. And Mrs. Leto, she was the quintessential Italian mother. Never afraid to scold us loudly and often, master of the guilt trip, and a fantastic cook. I won't ever forget how Bob and I would occasionally harvest a bag of black mussels off the rocks at Democrat Point on Fire Island, and she would make the most incredible mussels marinara. Bob had the most uncanny ability to show up at my home at dinner time whenever my mother would make her legendary eggplant parmesan. Now, this would tick my father off to no end, and we would all laugh like crazy over it. It never failed. We were all so fortunate to have such loving families, and what we put our parents through back then. Today, as a parent myself, I'm horrified at our antics, but it was a very different era. Of course, we all did plenty to make our parents proud of us back then as well. One example, in 11th grade, we all participated in a CYO production of the play West Side Story. I'm pretty sure it was at Bob's instigation, as he had done a couple of theater club things going back to Oliver in grade school, and the rest of us had not done that kind of thing. It was all sports activities for us back then. Looking back, this production was like a nexus in space and time that would not only cement lifelong friendships, but also set in motions events heard around the world. I will just say that Bob played Riff, the leader of the Jets. I won the part of Bernardo, leader of the Sharks. Giacalone was action, Riff's right-hand man. The lead role of Tony was played by Dennis Benatar, and Bernardo's girlfriend, Anita, was played by a waifish young woman with a giant voice by the name of Patty Andrzejewski. She and Dennis Benatar would later marry and then divorce, and she would then go on and carry his last name professionally. As most of you all know, Bob went to work with Pat Benatar in Richmond, Virginia for a while, doing club dates and show tunes. It wasn't a good fit for a jazz guy. About 2 months after he quit that gig, she would then be discovered at Catch a Rising Star. And the rest is history. Over the years, this was not a good topic to bring up with Bob. Bob loved music, loved jazz, and as we got older, we took advantage of living so close to New York City. He would scan the Village Voice and look for the best acts for us to go see. I knew nothing about jazz at that time. But I began my education soon enough by going into the city with Bob to iconic jazz clubs like the Village Vanguard, Sweet Basil's, Buddy's Place, the Blue Note, and seeing some of the greatest players in the world. Miles Davis, Buddy Rich, Lionel Hampton, Sonny Fortune, Elvin Jones, Joe Morello, the list goes on and on. I can't begin to count how many times we went in. And most of the times, we would wind up schmoozing with these giants of jazz. You see, Bob had a system. He would approach the headliner on a break, for instance, and since even way back then, Bob was a walking repository of jazz history and discographies, he would easily engage them in conversation. We saw Dexter Gordon one night at the Vanguard. Bob did his thing, then offers to get Dexter high. Next thing you know, we're on the back steps of the Vanguard smoking a joint with Dexter Gordon. He sucked that whole spliff down in an instant, handed Bob back the roach, and said in his gravelly voice, "Thanks, kid. What do you want to hear?" Bob's reply was Body and Soul, and Dexter played that the first tune back. Just incredible. Our enjoyment of these musical excursions was so deeply ingrained that when I was preparing to visit him this past October, despite his obvious conditions, he felt it necessary to warn me that he didn't think we would make it into the city this time. I think one of the most consistent qualities of knowing Bob through the years was that sense of impending adventure that was always there. Bob loved life and was always ready to go do something. Our trips to California, to Sequoia National Forest, New York City, crazy trips to Las Vegas and Reno. They say you attract what your frequencies are, and our frequencies back then were usually set to mischief and adventure, and we had our fair share. Angel, I think your brother Joe would agree with that. Just remind him of he and Bob's short-lived attendance at Arizona State. And of course, there was his music. At his peak, Bob was arguably one of the foremost jazz drummers of his time. He never stopped practicing. His concepts and techniques were at the top of the game. He used to say that after running through the George Stone stick control book, he would turn the book upside down and then do it that way. His finger technique was superb, lightning fast. And while Buddy Rich was an early inspiration, I know that he valued his time studying with Joe Morello beyond everything. His trips to New Jersey to study with Morello were like a pilgrimage. Joe was his guru. There was no doubt. After I left Long Island in the 80s to go to school in California, we didn't get to see each other much, but we never stopped talking. Bob was a constant in my life, and I know how fortunate it is to have a friend that spans a lifetime. Now, this may come as no surprise to anyone that knew Bob, but he could be, how could I say, cantankerous, irascible, thorny. Oh man, we could butt heads. But maybe that's a New York thing. I can easily say that Bob Leto made breaking balls into an art form. It was one of his favorite pastimes. We would talk on the phone several times a week. Invariably, a standard greeting would go something like, "Scumbag," and to me, "Dr. Douchebag." And we would know that all was well. We would talk politics, harass each other over unfortunate weather, discuss the women in our lives, and just enjoy our conversations. And whenever I did get back to Lindenhurst, we always went to see music in New York, or up to Bernie's for the jam, or to Sonny's place to watch Roy Haynes play drums. The music was always there, and I can't say thank you to Bob nearly enough. Now, a long time back, it was the late 70s, early 80s, we heard about a psychic medium by the name of George Anderson. George was a devout Catholic and, by all we could tell, quite genuine with his ability to channel loved ones that had passed. Bob, myself, my brothers and sisters, all had what can only be described as amazing experiences with things revealed or referred to that only family members could have been aware of. I believe it was the first time we went to see George. Bob and I had a joint session to save some money. Well, George says that Bob and I knew each other in a past life as small-time hoodlums in New York. He also said that Bob had a foot defect, a club foot on his left leg. Now, this was the same foot he had to have some toes amputated from in the last months of his life. Now, make of it what you will. Coincidence? Karma? I guess we will never know. Hearing of Bob's health decline at the end of last year, I knew it was time to get back to Long Island and visit Bob. I knew intellectually what he was suffering with, but I simply was not prepared for what I saw. It just crushed me to see how my lifelong buddy had declined. It was, I confess, one of the hardest things I have ever had to deal with. Of course, that is nothing compared to what Bob was going through. His last months were hard, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I guess what I want to say is that if there is some kind of afterlife, some kind of continuity after we shed our present form, I can only hope and pray that Pat Connolly, the love of his life, was waiting for him with open arms and her beautiful smile, and that he has found peace. I miss Bob greatly, and I will always miss Bob. Thanks for listening.